Good morning, afternoon or evening everybody. Welcome back to part 3 of building Otto Kretschmer's U-boat U99. This time out we are going to be painting and weathering, looking at a range of techniques including pre-shading, masking, detailing, oil washes and enamel washes. So without further ado, let's get cracking. First step is to prime and pre-shade. For this I am using this one-shot primer by Mig Ammo. Really, I should have laid down an all-over coat of grey primer, then either pre-shaded it with the black primer or some black paint. But I didn't have any grey at the time, so I risked it for a biscuit and went all in on the pre-shading straight away. I go over all the panel lines I created earlier with the rivet tool and the welds, laying down a healthy black line. I also highlight any areas that would have a natural shadow, like around the anchor and the edges of the dive flaps. Next, I work my way along the length of the boat, creating panel lines on the deck and shading in any areas I want shadowing. The same thing is done with the conning tower. It's important to remember that these are only shading marks. Accuracy isn't the aim here. It's just to create some difference in shade in the paintwork once complete. I continue this over the entire boat until the whole thing looks like a giant U-boat-shaped games board. The first part I am going to paint is the deck, so I start by masking off the sides with masking tape. Here's where the extra priming would have helped, as the masking tape did take off small amounts of my paint when removing. This can be avoided by sticking the tape down to a different surface first, such as a table or even your arm, just to make it slightly less tacky when applied to your model. As you can see, I didn't do this, but just a small tip. Once the sides are masked, I mix up a dark grey paint solution using German grey and white at a ratio of 9:1 mixed 50-50 with acrylic thinner. Then I start carefully painting the deck. I give this a good coat as I wanted it to be quite dark and wasn't overly concerned about the pre-shading in this area. You can still see the black is giving the grey some difference in certain areas, which is all I wanted for the deck. I'm careful painting around the conning tower, trying to avoid it as much as possible. The rest of the deck is painted, then it's time to carefully unwrap our work. Once unwrapped, I move on to the lower hull next, which means masking off the waterline. This line varies on different U-boats. Some go over the ballast tanks, some go around it. It's up to you which you choose. It's always good to do a bit of research to see which way you want to go. I opted to go around the ballast tanks, which I think is correct for U99, but happy to be corrected. I am using Tamiya masking tape for this task. It's great stuff. But vinyl tape would have been better as it can bend around curves, but I didn't have any at the time. I give the masking one last check over before I add the thicker masking tape above my line. Then, using the same solution I did for the deck, I carefully start painting the lower hull. I am doing a lot lighter layers here than I did on the deck. This is because I want my pre-shading to be a bit more prominent on these areas. You can also play around with the thinner levels in the paint to make things slightly more translucent, but I opted for several lighter layers. I keep going over the entire lower hull until I am happy with the result. Then it's time to unwrap again. This is my favorite part of any masking job. Although I am always nervous, it might take some paint with it. It is so satisfying to take it off and see a crisp line underneath. For me, this feels like the adult version of unwrapping a present on Christmas morning. Now it's time for the final paint layer, the light grey. But first we need to mask off all our dark grey areas, including the entire deck. I found the easiest way to do this is to use small pieces of masking tape and work around the whole thing, going around any features I want in the light grey. This did take a long old time to do, but it's important to remember, the better the masking, the easier the painting. Once the entire deck is covered, we need to do the reverse of the masking on the hull, so covering all the dark grey we did earlier. This is a lot more simple, especially now we already have our waterline marked out. Finally, we can get onto the painting. For this I'm using a dark sea grey from Tamiya, again mixed 50-50 with acrylic thinner. This finish looks about right for U-boats. As previous, I go over all the remaining areas with several light coats, being careful not to completely drown out the pre-shading. With the whole thing masked up, this is a pretty simple task. Whilst I have the sea grey in the airbrush, I paint the deck gun, followed by the life rings, and finally the flak gun. Now to unwrap it all again, the deck takes hours to mask up and minutes to take off, as it all comes off in big chunks. It did take small amounts of the paint with it, but I will use these areas for heavier corrosion when weathering later. The final thing to do is lock in all our hard work with some varnish. I am using this satin varnish by VIIb. This stuff works a treat and can be sprayed straight from a 0.5 nozzle. This coat will protect the paint from any further scratches and also from the thinners required in the weathering process. And there we go, main paintwork complete. Now for a spot of detailing, I start by adding the 88mm deck gun, followed by the flak gun. Next it's time for some detail painting, starting with the anchor. For this I'm using German grey from Vallejo. Vallejo paints are my go-to for hand painting, as when diluted with water are very easy to handle on a brush. I carefully paint the anchor in this German grey finish. I find this to be a great base coat for rust effects, of which I will add later. The wood slats inside the conning tower are next on the list, using this pale brown. This was a rather fiddly task painting these, trying my best to avoid the periscopes and details inside the conning tower. Next up, the rigging. For these I am using a gunmetal grey to give a bit of shine to the cables. Again, I will tone these down later with the rust effect enamels. The final details I'm painting at this stage are the life rings and the propellers. For the life rings, I mix up an orange colour using a flesh tone and flat red. I then carefully paint all the orange parts, taking extra care not to paint the grey brackets. Finally, the propellers. I don't have a gold Vallejo color, so I use this gold leaf from Tamiya. I find if you add a small amount of thinners, they are easier to hand paint for a bit. It's just a race against time before the thinners evaporate and you're left with a sludge. Both the life rings and propellers are put aside for fitting later on. With the first wave of detailing complete, I now move on to some oil work. I use these Windsor and Newton oil paints, decanting them to a piece of card to soak up some of the oil. This aids the drying time of the paints. I leave them for an hour or so, then I make up the first wash. For starters, I am mixing up a black wash for the deck walk. This is just black oil paint mixed with white spirit. I also decant some clean white spirit next to my wash. This is to either blend the wash or clean up any mistakes on the model. Now I have the wash made, I start filling in all the gaps on the deck plates. The aim here is to add some depth to the holes in the metal grid work. Naturally, the oil wash wants to go in the gaps, but any excess can be cleaned up with the white spirit. I go over the entire deck using this method, then I wait until it dries to check the result. I also go around details on the conning tower with this wash, just to highlight them as you would a panel line wash on a plane or a tank. Next, I'm going to add water streaks to the model using the white oil paint. To do this, I apply small dots of the paint on the hull and then streak most of it away using the white spirit in an up and down motion. Once it dries, it gives you realistic streaking, in this case to mimic the salt build up on the hull. Unfortunately, I had left my oil on the card slightly too long. It was a few days before I got round to this, therefore it was a lot more effort to streak off than normal. A small tip: use small amounts of the oil paint and use it fairly fresh. A few hours to a day on the card is about right. Before adding streaks to the conning tower, I fit the life rings so I can weather these at the same time. Then it's the same process as I did on the hull. As you can see, with the oil paint being a tad too dry, the effect is very strong, especially on the hull. To tone this down a tad, I mix up a grey oil wash and go over some of the heavy white areas. This not only blends the white into the grey paintwork, but also adds further definition to the streaks. The last bit of weathering to do is to add the all-important rust effects. I am using these rust streak enamels by Mig Ammo and Enamel Thinner for blending. I start with the light rust effect, going around all the limber holes and streaking downwards. I then blend the streaks with enamel thinner, again in a downwards motion. This is a really easy way to add realistic rust streaks to your naval vessels. It takes a bit of time, but is a very relaxing technique in my opinion. I also go around features like the anchor and any fixings I think would get corroded at sea. Next, I add some dark rust tones. I add these in a very similar way to the light rust. Just try to build it up at the bottom of the limber holes slightly more and blend with the thinners as done before. This adds further definition to the rust and gives it a bit of depth. This process is repeated across the entire boat, going around handles, rivets, and any features I want rust. If you make any mistakes, these can easily be repaired or removed with the thinners, so long as it hasn't dried. These thinners can damage the paintwork, so it is crucial to clear coat prior to using these effects. And that's it. Painting and weathering complete. I am fairly happy with how the effects came together at the end. I think the rust really helps to tone down the streaking and bring the whole thing together. That is it for this episode. The main bulk of the build is complete. All there is to do is add the final details and build a bespoke base. If you have enjoyed the video or found it helpful, please hit those like and subscribe buttons and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Hopefully see you next time for the final chapter of this U-boat series, but for now, farewell and happy modeling everybody.